Hi everybody, my name's Peter Murray. I work for a consultancy called Alexam Services. We offer advice and support for regulators, operators globally. We're based here in the EU, but the advice we offer is around identity, technology, and how those things combine to make the industry more sustainable. Today I'm with a gentleman called Neil Young. Neil works for Hillcrest Pragmatic, and I'm really keen to talk to Neil today, but before we do that, I'll let Neil tell you a bit about himself.
Hi, I'm Neil Young. I'm the founder and consultant in Hillcrest Pragmatic. Hillcrest Pragmatic is a consultancy firm focused on e-gaming, e-commerce and blockchain technology. And what we do is we help our clients to optimize processes, and we provide project management services, strategic advice, and we help to build governance, risk and compliance frameworks.
Good, and I think that's a point I was particularly keen to talk to you, because I've got a couple of these discussion points. But the key areas I was looking at is purely around the practicalities of implementation. You've worked with some of the biggest names in the sector, certainly from a gambling perspective. So this is more around not just talking about the high level, what you've got experience in is the intricacies of implementing them. And the other aspect really is around the fact you've got a foot in both camps. You've got a lot of gaming experience, but also the cryptocurrency side and blockchain and DLT. And I want to talk about later on around how those two things come together and where you've seen similarities or maybe differences. So probably worth a starting point as you have got a foot in both camps. What's the key points of focus at the moment from both sides for you?
So I think in both aspects, one of the key issues right now is optimizing automation. You know, we're trying to implement AI in a lot of automated systems these days, and it's important that those systems are working for us, not generating more work for the humans behind them. Another key aspect is definitely around customer due diligence, compliance, AML, and how that ties in with responsible gambling and affordability.
I think it's interesting talking about the affordability side of things, because I think the Gambling Commission here in the UK has certainly put out a few missives recently around how organisations are meant to be looking at affordability, but nobody quite understands what that means. I see gaming in a bit like the short-term payday loan sector. A couple of years ago, it's no longer enough to know that I'm a particular individual. You've got to know that I'm being able to afford to be able to do what I'm doing, and certainly that's a key issue in that. And tell us a bit about your experience working on the affordability side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying there is really the central issue right now, is that it's no longer going to be good enough to say, look, somebody's registered on the website and they seem to be reasonably okay managing their finances. You have to actually evidence a lot of how the customer is proving to you that they can afford it. But let's not forget, especially in gambling, this is a pastime. It's something they do for fun. So you have to manage that in a very delicate way, because, you know, if you start invading into my personal privacy with something that I'm supposed to be doing for fun, I'm just going to reject that entirely, and then you're none the wiser. But it is a very key part of regulatory compliance right now, and I think it's something that's only going to develop further.
One of the key areas, certainly for me, in both of the areas you work in, is around regulation. And from a gambling perspective, there was an announcement last week around the LCCP from the UK Gambling Commission, with a really interesting point on where verification sits and what it means. And one of those was around how it's going to be dragged forward in that process to a phrase they use was before the point of deposit, which is an interesting phrase. You've got to affirm the legal age. So what's your view on A, what that means, and then how operators can work with that?
Yeah, I think we all knew this was coming, really, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But it's a very fundamental change. It's a change to the commerciality of how we're going to commit to AV and our relationship with the customer. I entirely agree. You know, we've got to make sure those people are over 18 before we're taking the money off them. But what we're going to have to do, what a lot of operators are going to need to do, is going to have to be very clever about the way that they implement it, because we always know that we don't want to have the cost before we know we're going to get some return. So I think it's the right decision to go with bringing it before deposit. It makes a lot of sense from a regulatory perspective. But I think, let's be real, there is going to be a commercial impact here, and there's going to need to be some quite clever solutions to that.
And I think that's the key here, is so my background is from a supplier base into the industry, and it's around what those solutions are, because I think there's a real challenge here to the big aggregators, the credit rating agencies, about how they do their business. So have you any thoughts or ideas on the clever stuff they might be able to do to help with that?
Sure. I mean, what we're talking about is essentially now the customer's going to come in, they're going to register. We know that the aim of this is to make sure that children aren't registering for accounts. So that's going to have to be a key part of it, but there's only so much that we can do. This is still a person that's behind a screen. We don't get to see their face, and they can still say that they are their father or whoever it is. I think one of the changes that we're going to see in the technology is that we might have, everybody's been talking about streamlined onboarding process and registration funnel for years. Yeah. Millions are spent on this. But what's kind of been fallen by the wayside, or the strategy all along, has been fastest, simplest is best. In some cases now what we're saying is, we know that the regulator wants us to start being more responsible and protecting those people that need the protection most. Why don't we start looking perhaps at that registration process is where we start to pose the biggest challenges in the customer and business relationship. We know, for example, and it's covered by the new changes to the LCCP, that we're going to have to let our customers know ahead of time, look, there's going to be a verification process. We're not telling you when, but at some point we're probably going to ask you for a copy of your passport, and we're going to ask you to verify you are actually who you say you are. We're also going to have checks in place to make sure that you're not even getting to this stage if you're under 18. So I think a more honest and transparent approach is probably the way to go here. Maybe on the registration page, yes, you can register, and then we're telling you, look, this is what's going to happen. We're being upfront with you, and prepare the customer for the journey that they're about to go on.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. In many instances over the years, the industry, I think, shot itself in the foot, not doing the right things early enough. And I think a lot of this is about communication. You see some of the things from wherever the regulators around the world, same in Australia, same in Sweden, same here in the UK. It's about how you interact with the customer and what information you're giving them. So I think that misconception, when that news came out a couple of weeks ago around everybody's going to have to be verified 100% right at the start, is wrong. But the onus is on the operator to then start prepping the customer for realising what's going on. Because I've never quite understood why you would leave the full checks to the end, because that's the bit that gets the industry certainly a bad reputation.
Absolutely. I mean, I entirely agree with that. That's been a problem within the industry for both customer and for business, and it's just not efficient, it's not effective. It's actually covered by the changes that the UKGC released. You know, what they're saying is they want a better relationship between customer and business. They want the customer to be more informed, and this is entirely about communication. It's no longer going to be acceptable to let somebody come on, spend their money, pass minimal verification that we're actually not 100% sure of, and then at the point of withdrawal, now we're going to hit you with our process where now we want you to verify. Well, hang on, you've got the customer into a position where they are more likely to comply because it's in their financial gain to comply, but it's not necessarily a healthy relationship with the customer. Yeah. So I think to your point there, you know, it's a case of let's set this up properly from the beginning, and let's have a more effective relationship with the customer. Customer knows what's coming. We all want to make sure that the customer enjoys their time. This is all about providing entertainment. We do not want customers coming through any longer enjoying themselves, but at the point of maximum enjoyment, just as they reach the crescendo of ultimate enjoyment of the services, we hit them with the most negative aspect of it, which is now, please send us your details by email or however we handle that process. Yeah.
No, that's my view. I think it's something the industry should have and certainly could have done earlier, but they're being forced down that route now, and I think it is being forced, but a lot of the major brands are buying into this. I think nobody wants, if we stick to problem of gambling or safer gambling at this point. Nobody wants somebody who's where it's not healthy for them. So this concentration on harm minimisation, certainly one of the biggest changes I've seen over the last year or two is a proper investment, certainly from the brands around investment. Departments have gone from 1 person to 30. You know, they're starting to throw money at it, but are they being as efficient as they can? Or do you think they're using technology to the best extent as we sit here right now?
Yeah, that's one of the key things that I think has to really change. I mean, we see a lot of money spent on technology. This is why I focus a lot in the business on, is your automation optimized? Yeah. You might have automated verification, automated analytical systems, and they're great. You know, they're supposed to take a majority of the work and the effort away from the humans, because ultimately humans make decisions on other human cases, and we are talking about other human interactions here and behaviours. In many cases, it's been a case of put the money in, build the system, go with the big automation, but not check the optimization of that. It's a fine balance. If our analytical system detects, oh, this person has been logged in for X amount of time, the velocity of deposits has increased, or the velocity of stakes, or any of the metrics that we might use, and say that we judge that as potential issues with their control of the gambling. It's ultimately a human that deals with that at the end of the process. What the automation should be doing is setting that human up to just have a very fast process. Yeah. The machine has provided me all the information I need, so I make a quick and reasonable and accurate judgment. Yeah. That's where I think some of the changes will be, and I don't think it's quite there at the minute in the industry. Yeah.
Okay, well, clearly the issue of identity and fully understanding your customer is one of the key areas that's moved on. KYC, as we've always referred to it, I think it's fair to say, certainly what we've used for the last decade of time-stamped, fairly rigid identity is no longer fit for purpose. And regulators are pushing hard on that one for a more dynamic real-time approach. What have you seen in your role in advising and helping your clients work on upgrading their KYC?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most exciting areas right now, and that's why I have part of my business in blockchain, is because it's no longer, I think we're moving to a time where it's no longer going to be acceptable to say that there is a person called Neil Young, he exists and he lives at this address, and then therefore we know that it's definitely him. I think we're moving to, like you said, the real-time proper verification of people. Now, holding up a selfie of a passport, that's a good way of knowing, you know, it's definitely the person in the passport, but then you're talking about, you know, how are you capturing that data from them? Are you the best person to be protecting that data? How much does it cost you to protect that data as well? That's where I think perhaps blockchain maybe steps in with a more decentralized approach to identity, where the person themselves is responsible for their identity. Yep. When they approach your business through biometrics and all very confirmable details, they verify they are the only owner of that identity, and you don't need to see their passport. You get proof, confirmation from maybe the bank, the government. I think that's really where I see it heading in the future. Hopefully we get to that stage. It's really safer for everyone.
No, I think that's one of the key things for me, is that whole me-to-be society, which is verify once, use many, so that I hold the power of that data and I choose whether I open up a bank account or a gambling account, or I do my shopping through that. And I think we're heading down that road. We're not there yet by any means. Or any stretch of imagination, but I think that's the key part. Do you think we're very far from that at the moment? Or?
I think we're getting much closer. I mean, there's a lot of products out there, and I believe there's a couple that are implemented on some gambling sites right now as well, where this, what they call self-sovereign identity, you know, whatever the language might be, where the user essentially controls their identity, and we're talking about a trust-based system. Yeah. Some of those currently exist right now, and I don't think we're actually that far away. There's certainly numerous businesses want to crack this problem and make it a reality, and just from a logical point of view, it definitely makes sense to go that way. Give the user their data, they're responsible for their data. We've got to start moving towards that now.
Yeah. And I would absolutely agree with that. And I think the challenge is in the people who currently provide the KYC market, because that's not in their commercial interest. You know, this whole transactional approach you will get from any of the providers in there, the power will soon revert to the individual and they choose what to do with it. And I think you mentioned an important word there around trust. And the adoption and adaptation of that that's the key thing, certainly for the gambling sector, and I'm assuming the same from a blockchain and a cryptocurrency environment. It's got to be around trust of the information and how it's used.
Absolutely, I mean, sure, GDPR is up and running now, and the whole aim of that really, when we break it down, is just basically saying, look, I'm in control of my data, it's my data, it's not for you to go selling it, using it and abusing it, because that's what we've traditionally seen, unfortunately. So in spirit with GDPR and in spirit with what regulators want, and I think what most people really want, the consumer wants more security. They don't want to sign up for, again, it's an entertainment service. They don't want to sign up for an entertainment service and realise that they're jeopardising their identity because of that. We've seen a lot of very big data breaches recently, and in all those cases, absolutely every single one of them, the consumer not having to surrender critical information would have meant that there's less damage.
Data security certainly is an area I don't think the industry takes seriously enough. I think it's coming. I think there's certain people within the sector that are taking it, but you know, I personally know of a breach that was out there that went under the radar, didn't come out. The people involved were talking about historical data, which actually, strangely, is just as valuable as any up-to-date stuff. Do you see stuff, and I'm assuming it's the same with the blockchain environment, or sorry, cryptocurrency environment. Do you see an uptake in understanding the challenges around data security and actually doing something about it?
Yeah, and you know, I think one of the great things that the blockchain industry is starting to bring is it's got a lot of energy and it's very innovative. And I think in some traditional sectors such as finance and in gaming, although we like to say that it's very innovative, and there is a lot of innovative stuff that comes out, like the blockchain industry is really very cutting edge. People are trying to create the next internet or the next real fundamental change, and those people also really understand data. They work with an immutable blockchain where you can never delete the data from that blockchain. They're acutely aware of what should or should not be on or off the chain. So I think potentially the blockchain industry is going to drive a lot of this innovation that will cross over into gaming, cross over into finance, and hopefully make it a better environment for consumers and operators.
I think it's one of the biggest challenges certainly the gambling sector has, is just that willingness and ability to learn from other sectors. And it's the same whether I've talked to the financial services sector who've got great ideas that can come in, or probably more of interest to yourself, which is the sort of crypto environment and the blockchain. What do you think this industry, the gambling sector, can learn from those? Is there any couple of points you'd pick on most?
Yeah, I think it's definitely collaboration. You know, where we see the best innovation is where competitors, who we would normally deem as competitors, actually become collaborators, and that's for the greater good of all. I totally understand all businesses are competitive, and you know you're going to have that. But what you generally only see in gaming that you don't see across the financial sector, and certainly in many other sectors, is that you know banks work together, they share data for the greater good of the banking ecosystem. In blockchain, I think one of the greatest things that's happening is that's very much part of the process. They seem to collaborate a lot.
So it's almost a starting point for them.
Yeah, I mean, you can have two totally competitive projects in the blockchain space. They won't disrespect each other. Of course, they want to get a bigger market share. They want their product to win out. But they learn from each other. They share from each other. When one makes a mistake, instead of pouncing on that mistake or keeping information secret, it's all open source. It's all shared publicly. And that's leading to a much faster, innovative process.
Well, anybody who's heard me talk knows I bang on about this a lot. I simply don't get why the industry doesn't share more stuff, more data, especially when it comes now to responsible gambling, because everybody else does. The financial services sector do, the insurance sector does, and yet as an industry, the gambling sector has held back from that. I see self-exclusion as a starting point for that. They're being forced down that route, and for all the right reasons. But I think it could be so much more. And if you take that as a basis of, right, we're going to start sharing. And interesting from the Gambling Commission in the UK, it's been part of the information they've put out, is they're going to expect people now from a supplier base to be able to start sharing to get the best thing, primarily at a safer gambling environment. But they're going to start forcing people and challenging them to do that. And I just think it's something the industry hasn't done but has to address, and it has to address it quickly.
Absolutely, and I think one of the key parts you've mentioned there is the term forced. Yeah. The gambling industry has been forced to share some data for the greater good of the ecosystem or the industry. Whenever, and we see it in history, whenever people are forced to do something, it's not something they enjoy, and therefore they just cross the threshold to get the problem out of the way and deal with it. And I think if you had a more enthusiastic approach to the sharing of data, and you know, we're not talking about sharing everything like competitive advantage, we're talking about making a healthier industry. Yeah. If we see a more collaborative and open approach to this, maybe more transparent approach to it, I think the entire industry can win out much better.
So let's look at regulation from the non-gambling perspective. So we look at crypto, blockchain, and the fact is there's probably no regulation in a lot of the areas. But one of the points I was interested in, because we're sat here in the Isle of Man, and if you look at the Isle of Man and Malta, they're really keen on looking at this. But firstly, from a UK perspective, and I worked out, I didn't know who this was, but who regulates the sort of crypto market in the UK?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's one that's not particularly easy to answer. So that HM Customs and Revenue have come out with a position on how you should classify cryptocurrency. Really, it's the FCA is who you would be expecting to come out with a load of rules, but we're still hearing a lot coming out of the head of the Bank of England talking about it, but we're really in no man's land. We've no direction to guide us with regards to regulation in the UK.
Well, I guess certainly that lack of clarity is going to mean we end up in not a particularly good place. Whereas if you look at where we're sat here in the typical Isle of Man day, they've taken a lead along with Malta. If you look at the two jurisdictions that are leading the way on this, what's your thoughts on how both of those are regulating, or how it's sat at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see both Malta and the Isle of Man starting to just face up that this is a big industry, it's going to continue to grow, so you're better off starting to deal with it. Malta's gone the route of providing very specific regulations for each sector, such as ICOs, if you want a blockchain technology business. But really what I think is most impressive is that in both cases, they are embracing all aspects of the blockchain. You know, they're encouraging courses to be taught on it, so people are educated on it. And in the Isle of Man here, we just recently had the news that they're going to be launching the Isle of Man blockchain office and blockchain sandpit. So people can come here, they can get advice, they don't need to be afraid that they're going to break with regulation, because the regulator's going to sit and work with them, government's going to work with them. Yeah. Very much as France has done recently with some blockchain companies. Yeah.
I think it's one of those is adoption and around, I think you mentioned earlier, around trust, and I think regulation just becomes part of that, but meaningful regulation. I've been to a few regulators around the world, and they have to embrace this and regulate it in a really meaningful way if the consumer's going to end up trusting it. And it certainly seems here in the Isle of Man that's what they're after, and Malta's taken that the same. What do you think meaningful regulation looks like in this space? What do you think they have to do?
Yeah, so it's actually very difficult because blockchain's grown so fast, and as we spoke about earlier, it's quite innovative. So the regulation has to be good enough to protect the consumers, those operating in the space, but not stifle the innovation, which is easily done. I think what generally needs to happen is like what the Isle of Man has started to say with the blockchain office. Look, we don't know what regulation looks like right now, but what we certainly want to do is let's have the conversation. Yeah. Yeah. I think just more engagement with government is the way that it's going to go. Malta feels that it knows how to regulate already, so they've provided regulation. I still think that we're going to see a lot more need to discuss and work on that.
But I think that's that first step. Regulators need to embrace the idea of it and not be scared of it. There's certain jurisdictions around the world where it's so ultra cautious that it's almost like prohibition, and we all know that that doesn't work. So you either leave it to one side and let somebody else deal with the problem, or in the cases of those jurisdictions, you take it on board and learn. But a lot of it for me is about regulators who are often not part of that particular environment, getting to grips with what it is. Firstly, all understanding what it is. And I think, certainly from my interactions in that space, that's the biggest problem we've got as regulators, getting on board and meaningfully understanding what it is.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody should remember when Bernie Madoff, during the financial collapse, you know, he ran the biggest Ponzi in history. Yeah. He was also non-executive director of the SEC. And I don't know if you remember watching the court cases where other financial experts were literally up in arms after it all happened, saying, we handed you this on a plate, we told you, and you ignored it. What you see now is a very different SEC, very active. They might not want to jump straight into regulating cryptocurrency. They're taking the right steps. They're analysing the situation. If you've got to wait, you've got to wait. But they're more cautious now. They've learned from those errors of the past. And I think that's a good thing. I think we've seen too many times where regulators have either failed to act or acted in the wrong manner, and it's been quite damaging for an industry.
So what do you think are the biggest challenges around regulating? Let's take cryptocurrency. What's the biggest challenges around that?
I think one of the biggest challenges is actually perception. It's everybody thinks that when we talk about cryptocurrency, you say Bitcoin, everybody says, oh, it's got to be used for drugs and the Silk Road and money laundering. Do you know, in the US, recent indictments show that the reason why they indicted all those Russian co-conspirators was because they used Bitcoin. It's fully traceable. You use Bitcoin on a computer, you may be able to hide some aspects, but it's all recorded and it's an immutable blockchain. You will get caught. Briefcase of cash, it's not quite as easy. So once that perception changes, if you're a regulator right now, you're worried that your endorsement by saying that you're going to regulate something is going to put everybody up in arms saying, but that's all about drugs and crime, when realistically, when public perception changes and the regulator feels more confident that the people that ultimately put them in power are going to support them on that.
But I guess it's what came first in the horse and cart scenario, and I think for me personally, regulators have got to get stuck into this and understand it first of all. However they do that, you're not going to create an environment of trust just because the consumer thinks it's a good idea. The regulator's got to have something meaningful in that, and I think we've seen that elsewhere. So if we look at here on the Isle of Man, what's the latest on what they're doing around the whole crypto environment?
So the Isle of Man has actually got a great framework for either blockchain. When we say blockchain, we mean in the technology aspects of it, and then the cryptocurrency side of it as well, where we're talking about decentralized money, self-sovereign control over money. They have a great approach to it here so far, and it's being developed, whereby you would register as a designated business, as we call it here. So you work with the FSA, the Isle of Man FSA, you register as a designated business. They want to see what are you doing to control anti-money laundering controls, counter-terrorist financing controls. And we don't actually have an awful lot of regulation right now. We have some guidance, but certainly the GSC, the Isle of Man Gambling Commission, they've clarified exactly their position on cryptocurrency and virtual currencies. You can use them in gambling, no problem. We have the world's first fully licensed gambling blockchain product. Came from here, with the help of the GSC clarifying those points. Still a ways to go, but the FSA, the GSC, a lot of the government departments here, they're working together, and they're openly talking about it with the businesses trying to innovate in the space.
It's interesting to do that because you don't see that in certain other jurisdictions where it's almost a hands-off approach. They want somebody else to have gone and done it first.
Sure.
But maybe it's those jurisdictions where it's a bit more competitive to get license holders in. It's that willingness to take a bit of a risk in a risk-based approach that seems to be leading the way, certainly here and obviously in the likes of Malta. One of the areas, and by the time this goes out, I've probably done one of these talks at an event next week around AI and artificial intelligence. And it's interesting because everybody has a different understanding of what that is and how it's going to work. What's your views on A, what it is, and B, the practicalities of where that's working at the moment in the two areas you work in?
Yeah, it is a very misunderstood area, and everybody wants to do the AI thing right now. You know, there is a huge difference where I pre-program something in Excel. That's a form of artificial intelligence, but it's limited by how I programmed it. When we talk about real artificial intelligence, the system understands those complex things. I think the perception is that it's going to solve all our problems, humans will no longer work and the machine will run everything, but that won't be the case. As we discussed earlier, you know, with problem gambling issues, do you really want the computer judging those issues that are very emotional, that they're linked to a human emotion and a human tragedy in some cases, or otherwise? I think artificial intelligence is going to deliver a lot of advantage in automation. We're not there yet, and it's a very cautious word from me on that in the implementation of it.
I think we talk to people regularly about this, and it's a polarizing issue. People who think it doesn't exist and you can't actually create something. For me, it's like the early days of identity. Once you get it right, it will take away 80% of the issues around there, allowing human interaction and that ability to deal with the 20%. It's a bit like fraud. You know, you're never going to replace somebody who completely understands fraud and is making decisions based on what they see, but you can take away 80% of it and you learn from that. So that whole ability and adaptability of technology to do that, I think, for me, is going to be one of those key areas.
Absolutely, and you know, that's what I work on a lot with my clients right now is we look at machine learning and we look at where we can automate. Exactly to your point, we want to get rid of 80% of the work that we don't have to really deal with. We can get the machine to look after that. But it's very much about understanding it. You know, if somebody's going to consult on it or somebody's going to give an opinion on it, they really need to understand what the different levels of AI are. And the person who's going to consume that product needs to have realistic expectations of what they can achieve with AI. It is not going to replace us entirely.
I think it's you've put on a point there around sort of safer gambling, responsible gambling, however you want to phrase that. And I think you see there's companies out there buying other companies based on their algorithms they've got and how they're looking at that. I've not yet seen anything, but you know, we're all trying to join that up. I've not seen anything that's ever going to solve that problem at this point. I think it's take away a chunk of it, allowing you to concentrate on that.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, it's like the difference between bulldozers and shovels. You're going to clear a lot of ground with a bulldozer, but ultimately, if there's a pipe there, you're going to want to get your shovel out and make sure you don't burst that pipe.
Loving that analogy. That's what we're going to use. I guess a lot of this, whether it's the crypto world or the gambling world, is around mitigating risk. A lot about understanding the customers. From a practical perspective, what areas are you dealing with in the moment?
So I think one of the really key things that's happening right now is people are seeing the requirements for due diligence, you know, for your AML and your CFT controls, and then they're taking affordability and you're trying to implement that. Why shouldn't the two exist in one? Something I'm definitely focusing on with a lot of my clients, trying to optimize that process. We reach CDD thresholds, we know we've got to ask them to verify who they are. Well, you know, along that journey, we also identified that they could potentially have an issue, so why don't we just shore that up, reduce the amount of contact we're going to have with the customer, because we don't want to be pestering them all the time, and guarantee that they're safe in their journey, allow them to continue freely to enjoy the services that we're trying to provide them.
So is that about new technology solving that issue then?
In parts. Well, in fact, I would say old technology can solve it. I mean, you should know really how to use your Excel sheets and just basic analysis. We know what indicators of issues are. Let's take, for example, high levels of declines or an increase in deposit velocity over a certain time period. You know, that's stuff's bread and butter to most analysts, most fraud analysts. What we need to look at there, and what we don't see and what we can't really understand is, were those declines somebody in desperation trying to get their last penny out of the bank account, or were those declines somebody that's trying to steal credit cards, or was that somebody that simply forgot that they had a new card and they kept entering the wrong CB2. I think through better human investigations and education in the areas of responsible gambling, fraud, AML, and terrorist financing, we can make better assessments of those cases. And you know what? We can't always get to the bottom of it. We can take the best actions, the most effective actions, to make sure we guarantee a higher probability of success.
So when it comes to problem gambling, are we trying to reinvent the wheel here? Because I look at it and go, there's certain flags and behaviours that would mirror what's going on in fraud. Is the stuff that is the stuff we can use that's practically there now that we could use more efficiently for safer gambling?
Absolutely. We've always had an issue where we want to prevent fraud. We want to prevent duplicate accounts or abuse of the services that we provide. Strangely enough, we know for a fact, anybody that's been in the industry knows that when somebody has a problem with their gambling, they can tend to go a bit subversive. They'll use a different identity. They actually can, in many cases, replicate what we would have called a fraudster. And that's one of the issues traditionally in the industry. You know, you might have somebody contacts, and when the game is up and they say, I actually have a problem with gambling. No, we accuse them of being a fraudster, and we treat them as a fraudster instead of somebody that needs help. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. I think what you need is very good fraud analysts to just change their thinking, change their focus, and realize that in some cases, it's not actually an intended fraud. The fraud was just a means to the end. Yeah. It was actually an issue with gambling that triggered that action.
No, that's a great point, because I've looked at some of the suppliers that are out there from a technology perspective, and a lot of those are fraud engines. You know, it's processes. If somebody does this, then that happens. And yes, we have to understand there will be subtle differences of what's driving it, but those flags are there to be found, and there's technology out there now that can help support that. And I guess you see that in all aspects of what you do.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the efficiency gains that we need to see. It's getting expensive to comply with regulations. Whether you're a small company or a large company, compliance is an expensive process, and you don't want that to be just a massive cost to your business. There's actually a massive efficiency gain and revenue generation that can come from that, and that is by reducing the amount of time and effort you're spending on compliance where it's not actually in the benefit of anyone. Yeah. If you focus in on your compliance and you focus in on those areas at the highest risk that generally are in the highest numbers as well of revenue, that's where your focus needs to be. That's the risk-based approach, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting that you're working in the whole crypto environment, which is very different from gambling. But then is there anything the gambling sector can learn from these new environments?
I think definitely. I think we touched on it earlier. It's that collaborative approach to innovation, trying to bring the whole sector up so that everyone wins and it's healthier. And in return, I think in the crypto and blockchain space, they have a lot they can learn from the early days of gambling. We know in the gambling industry, we've been through the pains of growing regulation, refining that, and creating nice process from operator and regulator perspectives. I think the blockchain and crypto industries could learn a lot from that and shortcut a lot of the pains that they're going to have to bear at some point.
Yeah. So people talking to each other for the benefit of the industry, that's definitely one of my personal topics. So.
Yeah.
Okay. So look, that's been great. I really appreciate your time, especially the insight into the practical things you can do to raise the standards in the industry. So here from the sunny Isle of Man, I'd like to say thank you very much, and to Neil for his time today.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, really. Thank you very much. Cheers.